In 1950s Britain, many everyday meals were never written down. They were learned through watching, repeated through habit, and trusted without instruction. This video explores 10 easy meals British housewives prepared from memory alone, often using whatever the kitchen allowed that day. These dishes fed families during years shaped by rationing, routine, and responsibility. Each meal reflects practical knowledge that once defined home cooking but slowly faded from use. Watching this video matters because these meals explain how ordinary households survived, adapted, and ate together. What disappeared from plates also disappeared from memory, unless it is remembered here today quietly. Bread and dripping was one of the most common meals on British tables in the early 1950s. It required no recipe because every household already understood it. Meat drippings were saved from Sunday roasts and kept in jars near the stove. During the week, thick slices of bread were spread with the cooled fat and lightly salted. Sometimes onions were cooked slowly in the dripping to add flavor and warmth. This meal reflected years of rationing when waste was unacceptable and thrift was expected. Housewives relied on memory to judge freshness, portion size, and timing. Bread and dripping was eaten for lunch, supper, or whenever hunger appeared between duties. It carried the taste of meat into days when meat itself was unavailable. Children grew up recognizing its smell and texture as familiar and reassuring. As rationing ended and packaged spreads became common, this meal slowly disappeared. It was not written in cookbooks because it was considered too ordinary to record. Yet it shows how working kitchens turned leftovers into nourishment. Remembering bread and dripping matters because it reveals how survival, care, and economy shaped daily British food culture. This humble meal quietly connected generations through shared habits and unspoken knowledge. Bubble and squeak was a practical meal born from leftovers and routine in 1950s Britain. It usually appeared the day after a Sunday dinner, when cooked potatoes and cabbage remained. Housewives did not measure or plan it. They chopped vegetables by sight and feel, then fried them slowly in saved fat. The pan was kept hot but not rushed. The name came from the sounds made as the mixture cooked. This meal filled plates during a time when stretching food was a daily responsibility. Bubble and squeak was served for lunch or supper, often with bread or a fried egg when available. Every household prepared it slightly differently, shaped by habit rather than instruction. Children learned its taste early and associated it with warmth and familiarity. As fresh produce became easier to buy and leftovers less necessary, this dish lost its place. It required patience, memory, and attention, not packaging or instructions. Bubble and squeak mattered because it showed how meals followed rhythms of the week. Sunday created leftovers. Monday transformed them. This cycle defined domestic cooking for decades. When convenience foods replaced routine reuse, the knowledge behind this meal faded. What survived were memories, not methods. This dish explains how British kitchens once worked, quietly, economically, and without written guidance. These meals depended on experience passed through observation, repetition, and duty, reinforcing identity, resilience, and care within ordinary homes, where food carried meaning beyond nourishment and reflected responsibility, continuity, and survival during post-war years of scarcity and adjustment daily. Bread and milk was a quiet but dependable meal in many British homes during the early 1950s. It was prepared without a recipe because it relied on instinct rather than instruction. Stale bread was never thrown away. Instead, it was torn into pieces and placed in a saucepan. Milk was poured in slowly, just enough to soften the bread without flooding it. The pan was warmed gently until the mixture thickened. Salt or sugar was added depending on the time of day and household habit. This dish was served to children, the elderly, or anyone needing a warm and filling meal. It reflected a period when food waste was discouraged and comfort mattered. Housewives judged readiness by smell and texture, not time. Bread and milk was often eaten quietly, without ceremony, yet it carried emotional weight. It represented care, restraint, and continuity during years shaped by recovery after war. As packaged cereals and convenience foods entered kitchens, this meal faded from use. It was rarely written down because it was considered common knowledge. Bread and milk mattered because it showed how simplicity sustained families. It required attention, patience, and familiarity with ingredients. Remembering this dish helps explain how ordinary meals supported daily life. It also reveals how cooking knowledge once lived in hands and memory rather than books. When those habits ended, meals like bread and milk disappeared from tables and from collective memory, leaving behind only fragments of a quieter domestic tradition. Minced beef hash was a dependable meal in British households during the early 1950s. It was prepared without written guidance because most housewives had learned it through repetition. Cooked minced beef, often left from an earlier meal, formed the base. Potatoes were boiled, chopped, or mashed, depending on quantity and texture. Onions were added when available and cooked slowly to release flavor. Everything was combined in a pan and heated until well mixed and lightly browned. Salt and pepper were used sparingly, guided by taste rather than measurement. This meal allowed families to stretch a small amount of meat across several days. It was filling, warming, and suited to limited rations. Minced beef hash was commonly served at midday, when energy was needed for work and chores. Housewives understood how long to cook it by watching the color and listening to the pan. Children recognized it as a familiar and reliable dish. As fresh cuts of meat became easier to purchase and packaged meals entered shops, this dish declined. It was never considered special enough to record in cookbooks. Yet minced beef hash reflected the values of its time. It showed how thrift, care, and experience shaped everyday meals. Remembering this dish matters because it explains how ordinary families managed scarcity. It also reveals how practical cooking knowledge once passed quietly through households, sustaining daily life without written instruction or ceremony. Eggs and chips was a simple but dependable meal in 1950s Britain, especially in working households. It required no recipe because timing and attention mattered more than instruction. Potatoes were peeled by hand, cut thick, and fried slowly in dripping or lard. The cook judged readiness by color and firmness, not by a clock. Eggs were fried last to ensure warm yolks and set whites. This meal appeared when meat was scarce or set aside for another day. It was filling, affordable, and familiar to every family member. Eggs and chips was often served for lunch or a light supper. Housewives relied on sound and smell to manage the pan. Children learned patience while waiting for the chips to brown. This dish reflected post-war habits shaped by rationing and limited choice. It carried comfort without excess. As ovens improved and frozen foods entered shops, the skill of pan frying declined. The meal remained known but less practiced at home. Eggs and chips mattered because it showed how everyday cooking depended on judgment rather than instruction. It reveals how ordinary kitchens worked before convenience reshaped routines. Remembering this meal helps explain how simple foods sustained households through habit, care, and practical experience passed down without written guidance. Sausage and mash was a common meal in British homes during the early 1950s. It was prepared from habit rather than instruction, because every kitchen understood its steps. Sausages were often stretched with bread or cereal fillers, making them affordable and filling. They were fried slowly in a shallow pan until browned and firm. Potatoes were peeled, boiled, and mashed by hand with a little milk or dripping. Salt was added carefully, guided by experience. Gravy, when available, was made from pan juices and thickened without measurement. This meal was served at midday or in the evening, depending on work schedules. It provided energy and comfort after long days of labor and housework. Children recognized it as reliable and satisfying. Housewives judged doneness by color, sound, and smell, not written rules. Sausage and mash reflected a period when meals balanced restraint with nourishment. It allowed small amounts of meat to serve entire families. As rationing ended and butcher shops offered wider choice, This meal remained but slowly changed. Packaged mixes and ready sauces reduced the need for judgment. The older method faded from practice. Remembering sausage and mash matters because it shows how confidence in cooking once replaced instruction. It reveals how ordinary meals carried responsibility, care, and routine. These qualities defined everyday British food culture during years of recovery, when feeding a family depended on memory, patience, and skill learned at home. Such meals anchored households, reinforced stability, and ensured survival through modest ingredients and practiced domestic knowledge daily. Cheese on toast was a familiar meal in British homes during the early 1950s. It was prepared without a recipe because it depended on judgment and timing. Slices of bread were toasted until firm but not dry. Cheese was grated or sliced by hand, using whatever variety was available. It was placed on the hot bread and returned to the grill until melted and lightly browned. Worcestershire sauce or mustard was sometimes added, guided by habit rather than measure. This meal appeared at lunchtime or late in the evening when a full dinner was unnecessary. It provided warmth, protein, and comfort during years of limited choice. Housewives knew exactly when to remove it by watching the surface bubble and listening for crackle. Children associated its smell with home and routine. Cheese on toast was valued for its speed and economy. It required attention, not instruction. As packaged snacks and ready meals entered shops, this dish lost its importance. It remained known but was no longer relied upon. Cheese on toast mattered because it showed how simple ingredients met daily needs. It reflected confidence built through repetition and care. Remembering this meal explains how ordinary kitchens worked, where experience replaced written guidance and food carried reassurance during uncertain post-war years. Boiled bacon and cabbage was a steady meal in many British households during the early 1950s. It was cooked without a recipe because the method was already understood. A joint of bacon, often salted, was placed in water and simmered slowly until tender. Housewives judged readiness by smell and resistance, not by time. Cabbage was added near the end so it softened without losing shape. Potatoes were boiled separately and served alongside. This meal was filling and reliable, especially during colder months. It used inexpensive cuts and fed large families with little waste. Boiled bacon and cabbage appeared most often at midday, when a substantial meal was needed. The cooking process was calm and predictable, fitting easily into daily routines. Children recognized it as ordinary and expected. Its flavor came from patience rather than seasoning. As fresh meat cuts became easier to obtain and tastes shifted, this dish lost popularity. It was seen as old-fashioned and gradually set aside. Yet it reflected values that once defined home cooking. Boiled bacon and cabbage showed how nourishment, economy, and routine shaped meals. It required attention and experience, not written instruction. Remembering this dish matters because it explains how families were fed during years of restraint. It reveals how cooking knowledge once lived in repetition and habit. When those habits ended, meals like this disappeared quietly from everyday life, taking with them a record of how households managed scarcity with consistency and care. Peas pudding was a simple, nourishing meal served in many British homes during the early 1950s. It required no recipe because preparation relied on memory and observation rather than instruction. Dried split peas were soaked and boiled slowly until soft. Housewives stirred the mixture carefully, adding water as needed to reach a thick, smooth consistency. Salt, pepper, or a small amount of fat was added according to taste. Leftover meats or vegetables were sometimes mixed in, creating variety without waste. This dish was often served at midday or as a light evening meal. It was inexpensive, filling, and easy to prepare in large quantities, making it ideal for households managing rationed ingredients. Children became familiar with its soft texture and mild flavor. The cooking process required patience and attention, not measurements or written guidance. As convenience foods and packaged soups became more available, peas pudding slowly fell out of favor. It remained known in some regions but disappeared from everyday menus. Remembering this dish matters because it illustrates how ordinary families turned basic ingredients into sustaining meals. Peas pudding reflects a period when home cooks relied on experience, rhythm, and judgment to feed their families. It shows how domestic knowledge, passed quietly through households, shaped sustenance, economy, and care during post-war Britain. Jam and scone was a simple, beloved meal in many British homes during the early 1950s. It required no recipe because housewives relied on practiced skill rather than written instructions. Scones were prepared from basic ingredients: flour, a small amount of fat, and milk, mixed by feel until the dough reached the right consistency. They were shaped by hand and baked until golden. When ready, they were split and spread with jam, often homemade or rationed, and sometimes a little butter if available. This meal appeared at midday, in the afternoon, or as a light supper. It was filling, sweet, and comforting, offering a small indulgence in otherwise modest diets. Children eagerly anticipated its taste and texture. Housewives judged dough and baking time by touch, color, and smell. Jam and scone reflected post-war resourcefulness, where simple ingredients became meaningful treats. As commercial baked goods became widely available, this meal was less frequently prepared at home. Yet it remains significant because it demonstrates how ordinary families balanced economy, care, and enjoyment. Remembering jam and scone explains how domestic routines created satisfaction, sustenance, and continuity without reliance on cookbooks. It preserves knowledge of everyday meals that quietly shaped British food culture and domestic life during years of scarcity and adjustment. These 10 meals reveal a side of 1950s British kitchens rarely recorded. They were shaped by memory, habit, and careful attention rather than written recipes. Each dish, whether humble bread and dripping, hearty minced beef hash, or sweet jam and scone, carried meaning beyond nourishment. They show how families adapted to rationing, stretched ingredients, and maintained routine. Remembering them preserves not only flavors but the skills, patience, and care that defined home cooking. By revisiting these lost meals, we honor ordinary kitchens and the quiet expertise of housewives whose knowledge sustained generations. These recipes may have disappeared, but their legacy remains.